Hi, everybody. Got just about a minute here to noon. We've already started recording, so welcome. I'm actually in my law office today, downtown.
So am I.
So I'm not a lawyer, for those of you who don't know, but I do work with so welcome. It's can't believe it's mid-April already. Hopefully some of you have been to ball games. I've been to 2 at Camden Yards already, going to a 3rd this weekend. It's weird, but it's neat to be back. I will keep admitting people as we go. I'm going to read our upcoming events here for the Babe Ruth chapter. Starting in, well, we have our monthly baseball babble this weekend on the Sunday, the 25th at 7. And then David Creel will be talking to us on May 5th from 7 to 9 p.m. And then the next called shot lunch in May 19th, we're actually going to have the general manager of the Aberdeen Ironbirds, Jack Graham, speak to us. It'll be the morning after their home opener, so he might be a little tired, but he's agreed to it.
Yeah, no, that'll be fun.
And he's a good guy. We met him a couple years ago. Before he was the GM, he was on staff up there when we hosted a summer event at when they were still a short season, and now they're a full season team. We have Janet Marie Smith. Everybody better know that name. Who will be talking to us on June 2nd about ballparks, building and renovation. And since she's a member of our home chapter, that's going to be a good one. She's currently a vice president of the Dodgers, so she's still high in the baseball world and held in high recognition as she should be. Today we will have, there he is, Jerry will speak to us about his novel. It involves a local hero of mine, because I'm from Northeast Pennsylvania, local legend, and Christy Mathewson, who was born about a half hour outside of Scranton, where I'm from. So I'm interested to hear this. You can put up questions in the chat. Jerry, you can put up your email address for people to reach out. You guys can put questions up. I'm going to disappear, but be here, and we'll keep admitting people. We have a good crowd, so thank you to everybody for joining us. It's hard in the middle of the day. I see a lot of our regulars, and much appreciated. This is recorded and will be on the SABR website probably within a few days. So, Jerry, I will let you take it over. You have rights, and you can share your screen whenever you're ready.
Great, thanks very much, and thanks to everybody for being here. I put my email address in the chat, and also some couple of the photos and old newspaper things that you'll see today, and a couple of the documents. I appreciate everybody taking time out of the day to come here. There are some familiar faces I see, and I'm going to share some slides now. So let's hope this works. And slideshow. And everybody see some slides?
Yep.
Okay. This first page is a selection, as you can see, of a chunk of baseball nonfiction literature. I don't have to tell you, there's an extraordinarily broad nonfiction literature on this sport. A lot of it has to do with specific games or players or teams or events, but there's a corner of it that I like to think of as the organic literature of baseball, and most of these titles come from that area. They're more about the sport itself, its management or tendencies, social impacts, and that sort of thing. So there's an extensive literature of this type. There's also an extensive fiction literature in baseball, but I think it tends to be a little bit narrower. It focuses on a lot of those things I mentioned at first: the players, the games, the teams, and less so on the organic aspects of baseball as an institution. So what I'm trying to do is find the middle ground. And I think I came across some materials that got me started on this path that actually are in that middle ground. sort of in line with the Charlie Chaplin quote here. There are some facts that aren't in the factual literature, and it might be that the way to bring those facts out is through fiction. So that's what I'm trying to do in this book. The whole project started back in 2018 when I was zoning out in a lounge chair in front of a TV watching a rerun of an old Antiques Roadshow program that had first been broadcast in 2003. And there was a fellow from down in Georgia who had, I think, purchased a box of local military documents. He was a military collector, not a baseball collector. And he had purchased these documents and was going through them and found some things that he then brought to Antiques Roadshow. And the things he brought were some papers that showed that there had been some ball players down in Georgia back in the period of World War I, including a number of players who would eventually find their way, once it was established, into the Baseball Hall of Fame. And I thought that was kind of interesting. And then I started to really think about it, and I realized that there were some inconsistencies there. In effect, the more I looked into it, the more I realized that there was a violation of one of the basic laws of physics involved, that the same object can't be in two places at the same time. Or in this case, the same set of baseball players couldn't be playing in Georgia or training in Georgia at a military camp and playing in the major leagues at the same time. And yet that seems to be what the official record shows. So that's how I got started in this book. I got curious about how that might be the case and started wondering what set of facts I could imagine that would actually account for that. And that's what the book is about. The two central players in the book are familiar to everybody on this call, Christy Mathewson and Cobb. I don't have to tell you anything about them, except that I will note that the two of them were friends. Cobb didn't have a lot of friends in the game, but Matheson seems to have been one. And they had an intertwined history, which we all know about, and which I'll say some things about in a moment. But there's also context for this story, and the context is World War I. By 1917, the U.S. was under a lot of pressure to enter World War I. The British were certainly anxious to have the U.S. come into the war because their resources were tremendously strained. But there was a lot of reluctance politically. This was not a popular thing, and the president was trying to stay out of the war. But then Germany made a mistake. Down at the bottom left corner here, the Western Union telegram is something called the Zimmerman telegram. If you can read it, depending on the size of your screen, it's got a bunch of numbers on it. It's a coded telegram. It's a telegram that was sent from Germany, from the foreign minister, I believe, to the ambassador, German ambassador to Mexico. And what the Germans didn't realize was that all of the transatlantic cable traffic in that era ran through England, and the English had tapped into the line and they were reading the mail, basically. So they intercepted this telegram and they decoded it. And basically what it said when they translated the decoded telegram was that Germany was offering Mexico a deal. That Mexico had lost a great deal of land to the United States, and it was a lot closer in time than it is today when that had happened. And relations between the US and Mexico were not at all good in those days. And the telegram was an offer from Mexico, from Germany, that if Mexico would essentially attack the United States from the south, that after Germany and Mexico won the war, they could have their land back. And that was, all the way up into Colorado and places out to California and so forth. Well, the English intercepted the telegram. They sent it to Washington, and it was released in Washington. And once it became known in Washington that Germany had offered this deal to Mexico, the US, within a couple of days, entered the war on the side of England and began trying to get itself ready. But there was no large standing military in that time, so they had to start recruiting people. And you can see the declaration of war and the first call, in this case, for the Navy here. So that's the context for this story, is that the US is suddenly going into an unpopular war for which it's not prepared. The first week after the US declared war, the president hired this man, George Creel, and he created the group at the bottom called the Committee for Public Information. George Creel became the first official propagandist of the United States. And he had a complex job. He was to defend the country against propaganda coming in from the German side, a lot of which was simply meant to make people not want to participate in the war and to make it difficult to wage the war. But he also had to propagandize within the United States to encourage people to support the war and participate and get into the military. And a couple things to know about George Creel. One, he was a very powerful fellow, and he was ruthless. For example, if you've read Skip Desjardins' book, September 1918, and the subtitles War, Plague, and the World Series, he talks about the pandemic in 1918 and how the military handled the pandemic. And what they did is they had outbreaks of influenza on military training bases that were closely adjacent to large American cities. The case that Desjardins looks at primarily is Boston. And rather than acknowledge that the flu was there and quarantine the bases, they were worried that if they did that, a la George Creel, that they would undermine support for the war. So they left the gates open, and they allowed a free flow of people and commerce between the bases where the influenza was and the cities, and the result was a rapid expansion of the pandemic. But that was a price that Creel was prepared to pay. He was a ruthless fellow. The other thing was that he knew the potential of baseball for propaganda. A couple of years before this, he had been the president of the New York State Suffrage League. And one of the things he did to advance the cause of suffrage was bought, I'm looking for the number, 8,000 seats in 125 boxes at the Polo Grounds when the Cubs came to town one day in 1915. And the suffragists took over the ballpark and basically laid their banners all over the place. It was just a big propaganda effort. So he was ruthless, powerful, and appreciated the value of baseball as propaganda. Now, as 1917 season wore on and into the beginning of 1918, baseball came under a lot of pressure to demonstrate its patriotism. And scenes like this became commonplace. This is from Washington, and the players are doing close order drill using their bats in lieu of rifles. I have another picture from Cleveland where they were actually using either rifles or mock rifles. But you've all seen these pictures, they're commonplace. And this was what the teams were trying to do to demonstrate that they were good citizens and supportive of the war. And it did them okay for a while, but some of the players began to join up in 1917 and early 1918. And on the left here is a letter from Franklin Roosevelt when he was Assistant Secretary of the Navy, forwarding a letter that he had received from Harry Frazee, who was president of the Red Sox at the time, pointing out that a number of Frazee's players had signed up, and he was having trouble fielding a team for the 1918 season, but he had identified a couple of those players who were just doing clerical work in Washington, in Boston. And he wondered if it wouldn't be possible to get those two players released and allow them to come play. And Roosevelt is writing to the commandant of the 1st Naval District in Boston, asking if that couldn't be possible. And there's a little handwritten note down toward the end of the letter says, of course, if we have to call them back, we can always do that. The fellow in the middle, and he was in the middle in a lot of ways, is Newton Baker, who was the Secretary of War. And eventually, the country had such a problem recruiting soldiers that they had to institute a draft. And it was his decision in June of 1918 to institute the draft. But when he did, he exempted baseball players. And that didn't
Baseball Hall of Fame and Museum.
Pardon?
And also site of our continuing series of virtual Voices of the Game program.
Okay, I'm back. I don't know what that was. So they instituted a draft, but they exempted baseball players. It lasted about a month. And in July, you can see at the right, there's a telegram from Harry Frazee to Gary Herman, who was chairman of the National Commission, saying, Baker just removed our exemption. If that's going to happen, we need to end our season quickly. Please let me know what you think. And down at the bottom, and I know some of you are on small screens, so I'll read you the cartoon that came out at that time in the Boston Post. Baseball players must fight or work in war necessities industries if within the draft age. So they were being offered a choice between working in defense industries or joining up. And so the balloon says, if I fight, the soldier's pay will not pay my wife and children's keeping with the high cost of living, and it will take a long time to learn a lucrative craft. And then underneath, it's a gloomy outlook for baseball, the national game. So the players were coming under pressure, and they had to make a choice, those who were draft eligible, to either go to work in a war industry or join the military. This looks like a picture of the baseball team, Bethlehem Steel, but it's actually a picture of players from the Bethlehem Steel Industrial League. This league had 6 teams, and according to, and I'm going to look at his paper here, according to Brian McKenna, who did an article on this for SABR some time back, the 6-team league included 71 active or future major leaguers, and some of the names were Eddie Plank, Joe Jackson, Babe Ruth, Joe McCarthy. It was a big deal. They had high quality play, and they were very organized, and there were more leagues than this, but this was just the Bethlehem Steel League. Well, Ban Johnson, who was president of the American League and really the power on the National Commission at that point, said this, and I'm going to read the quote. The American League does not desire to impugn the motives of players who have gone into this work, into the industrial side. Some of them were patriotic, and he knew by this time that a lot of the players who went to work for wartime industries were simply being paid to play in things like the Bethlehem Steel League. That was their work. And he continues then to impugn their motives. Some of them were patriotic, but if there are any of them who are Class 1A, I hope Provost General Crowder yanks them from the shipyards and steelworks by the coat collar and places them in cantonment to prepare for future events on the Western Front. The American League does not approve of players trying to evade military service. Now, given that baseball is trying to appear patriotic and do its duty here, why would he say this? There are a couple of possible reasons. One is this statement was made 1 week after Joe Jackson announced that he was leaving the White Sox to go play in the Bethlehem Steel League. So Johnson was losing a key player. But also, you have to think about the historical context. We're in 1918 here, and it was only 3 or 4 years earlier when the Federal League made a big challenge to the major leagues. They were buying off players, trying to overcome the reserve clause and raise the salaries to double. And there had been a big fight. And Johnson was apparently concerned that the industrial leagues were becoming so powerful and attracting so many of the better players from the major leagues that after the war, they would become a major rival to the American and National Leagues. And so he was speaking with that concern in mind as well. Well, the way this all played out was that players got into the military, but there was an area of the military service that wasn't attracting enough volunteers or even draftees who were willing to do the work. And that was the Chemical Warfare Service, a new service that dealt with poison gas. And General William Seibert here got together with some of the powers that be in Washington, and they had to solve this problem. So they called a big, what we would call today, a big news conference. They got together all of the most prominent journalists in Washington, and they announced that they needed to find prominent athletes, especially baseball players. It didn't matter how old they were or how young they were, but they needed to have athletic skill. And they were going to recruit them to the Chemical Warfare Service to serve as role models to show that the work was really easily doable, wasn't dangerous, and people would want to come in and associate with these baseball players in the Chemical Warfare Service. So they set out on a path to do that. Now, General Seibert got in touch with Percy Houghton, who was the recently retired head football coach at Harvard at a time when that probably meant something, and had more recently still bought a minority interest in the Boston Braves. Houghton got in touch with Branch Rickey, who was out in St. Louis, and I think between jobs at the time and between teams. And Houghton and Rickey both were made majors in the Chemical Warfare Service. And then Rickey set out to recruit some players, and he recruited Cobb and Matheson to the Chemical Warfare Service. And the rest of the story, we've all heard that at the end of the 1918 season, in the fall, maybe October, though the dates tend to vary a bit, Matheson and Cobb are made captains in the Chemical Warfare Service. They're shipped over to France. They're going through some training. There's a training accident. They both get exposed to the gas. Cobb not so much, but Matheson apparently rather badly. And here's Ty Cobb's telling of the story in his autobiography, where he says, Matheson told me, Ty, I got a good dose of the stuff. I feel terrible. And Matheson then comes home and in 1925 dies prematurely of tuberculosis. And the TB is attributed to his exposure to gas in the war. And here's a paragraph from the Associated Press story when he passed away. And I'll read again because I know some of you can't see this well on your screen. That paragraph says, a hero of the World War, as well as of the diamond on which he was the first big college star. He died late last night of tuberculosis and pneumonia, the result of being gassed while a captain in the Chemical Warfare Service in France. So there is the story right there in a nutshell. And that's what we all believe. Maybe. A couple of years ago, Howard Rosenberg published a piece in Inside Sources where he brought together some contrary evidence. He pointed to an affidavit from a divisional surgeon that said that Matheson's exposure to poison gas occurred elsewhere in France, not in this training, and only after the war ended. Then General Amos Fries, who succeeded Seibert as the head of the Chemical Warfare Service, says that Matheson was never exposed to any more than just a little whiff of harmless gas that they used in training. And Branch Rickey said that he was with Matheson throughout the training in France and that there was no accident, nothing happened. Not in the Rosenberg article, but I don't think, but another fact is that Christy Mathewson had a brother. His brother contracted tuberculosis in 1914 and died of it in 1917. So he could have been exposed to TB within his own family. And the other confounding factor here if you want to do research on some of this, is that the majority of the military records from this period were stored in a National Archives warehouse in St. Louis. And in 1973, there was a fire that took days to put out, and most of that material was apparently lost. So there are some difficulties with that. So we know there's a myth. We know there are some issues with it. What else might we know? Let's do a little bit of imagining. What if there was a camp, a training camp in Georgia, where the Gas and Flame Division, as the Chemical Warfare Service was called, where they trained? And what if the Army and baseball got together, consistent with exactly what General Seibert called for and what Creel would have wanted? The Army and baseball get together and they create a show unit. And it turns out that 7 of the players in this unit, eventually 20 years later, when there was a Hall of Fame, would be in the Hall of Fame, some of them in the very first class. And what if this unit in Georgia was led by not Captain Christy Mathewson, but Lieutenant Christy Mathewson, who reported up the line to Major Rickey? And what if the members of this unit included Corporal Frank Baker, that's Home Run Baker, Corporal Max Carey, Private Frank Chance, Corporal Ty Cobb, Private Davy Jones, Ordnance Sergeant Honus Wagner, and Private Ed Walsh? Now that's something to contemplate. You wouldn't want to face that unit on an intramural baseball field. What if the members of that unit were actually documented to be in Georgia training on poison gas? And apparently at the very same time, they were documented in official box scores to be playing or managing major league games. And what if, having gone to all the trouble of putting together this propaganda dream team, as we might call it today, with all of these really prominent players, how is it that there's no mention of this unit in the press of the day? There's no mention at the Hall of Fame. There's no mention in histories of the game. There's no mention in any of the biographies of any of these players. What could account for that? This is where I went into this story. Well, it turns out that there was such a camp. It was called Camp Hancock. Here's a picture of it. You can see it was a delightful place. There were hundreds, if not thousands, of tents. There were a few permanent buildings, including a very large hospital, which I think is a little further to the left than this particular photo shows. And at the bottom of this page, you can see there are 3 maps. The one lower left is a map of the city of Augusta, Georgia. Now, Camp Hancock was just outside of Augusta. And this map dates, if I remember correctly, to approximately 1909. So it's roughly a period map. And that's the entire city. Bottom right is a map of the built up areas, what you see in the picture above, at Camp Hancock. And I'm going to lean into the screen if you'll let me. I'm sure you can't read this. I'm going to read some of the caption here. Camp Hancock, Augusta, Georgia. Construction started July 1917, lists the contractors. Number of buildings erected, 1,319. Camp capacity, 45,099 men. Total area of camp, 13,811 acres. Camp proper, which is to say the built up area, 1,777 acres. It was a big place. Now, let me see if I can put the pen on here. And if you look at the map in the middle, the city of Augusta is there. I hope you can see the red circle. The built up part of the camp is here. And the entire camp is all of this. It was a big place. If you go there today, you'll find that the area of the camp is covered with housing developments. There's a great big regional VA medical center. There's a big general aviation airport with runways where all the CEOs park their private jets when they come into town for the Masters. There's a golf course, not Augusta National. there's shopping centers. It is a big part of Augusta. And this was all part of Camp Hancock back in the day. There was also such a unit, and this is the first of the two papers that got me started on this journey. This is a payroll for Ordnance Depot Company 44, Camp Hancock, and the dates at the top are June 1 to June 30. Now, I will tell you that this is not the original of the paper. When you go, and there's a link in the book that'll get you there, when you go and look at the episode, you'll see it's very hard to read these things. I had to do some enhancement. And along the way, I'm sure that we made some mistakes, but also we introduced a couple of small errors so we could always tell the originals from the illustrations that we did for the book. And one of the places that happened, I will tell you, is in the date at the top. The original paper has the date from June 1 to June 20. We changed it to June 30, but it like the other changes we made, it's not material to the story. Now you'll see I've made it a little easier to tell who some of the members of this company are by putting the names down the left side. You'll see the first name is John Wagner. Now it's possible that it was a John Wagner, but in context, I would argue to you that this was really Honus Wagner, and that one of two things happened. Either, this being 1918, people who had German sounding names were anglicizing them. And it was a widespread practice. So a Johann or a Honus might well anglicize it to John. That's one possibility. The other is that whoever the company clerk was in the army didn't know how to spell Johann or didn't hear it properly and simply put John. But you can make the same judgment I did or a different one. But you'll see also that we have T.R. Cobb, Max Carey, Frank Chance, Davy Jones, the one of these players who didn't make the Hall of Fame. Ed Walsh, Frank Baker. So here is the first document, and it gives the Army serial numbers for these players. It tells you their rate of pay. It tells you if they had any reasons to have additional pay, and so forth. And it's signed down the bottom by H.F. Barnum, the company clerk. Well, that's enough to get you thinking. So let's do some more thinking. What if something happened? There was an incident at Camp Hancock. It involved Christy Mathewson, Ty Cobb, others. And instead of showing how easy and safe it was to work with chemical weapons, poison gas, it actually showed the opposite, that it was dangerous work. And what if, as it would have, that incident embarrassed the Army and the other interests? Here you have a unit that they put together to get a lot of publicity, to attract a lot of people to join the Chemical Warfare Service, and all of a sudden something happens that makes that highly unlikely and probably goes the other way altogether. Now, if any of you have PR experience or crisis management experience, you know exactly what would happen at this point. There would be a meeting of as many gray hairs as they could pull together to figure out what to do about this situation. And like most organizations, they might very well have done two things. One, figure out a way to cover it up. Two, develop a cover story so nobody'd ever go looking for it. So let's say that there was, in fact, such a meeting at the base, and the Army and baseball and Creel from the Committee on Public Information were represented, and they moved decisively to cover this incident up, and they developed a cover story. And the cover story sent Cobb and Matheson to France and created the appearance or the sort of pseudo event of a training accident in France. And Matheson and Cobb went along for the very same reason that they volunteered for this unit in the first place, which is that they were patriots. And let's say that the remainder of the unit, all the other baseball players, the non-players who were in the unit, everyone else involved, everybody who knew anything about that, about what happened, was sworn to silence on pain of death. Now, this is wartime, and ordnance and there were things that the Army could reasonably claim were matters of national security, and they very well may have played hardball in a situation like this if it occurred. And let's say that George Creel closed that planning meeting with these words: "Gentlemen, remember, for the good of the nation, for the good of the Army, and of course, for the good of baseball, this never happened." That's where I got my book title. Here's the other piece of paper, and here's where it gets kind of interesting. If when you have a chance to look more closely at this, you'll find that there are several anomalies here. For some small ones, for example, June 3rd, if you look down the day of month column, got left out, and then it gets put in between June 5 and June 6. And there's an arrow going over to a note of some sort, and this was how the original was. There was a note and it was torn off. So there's some indication that something happened on June 3rd, but it's not part of the record anymore. You look at Private J.A. Armstrong on June 4th, the first June 4 entry. J.A. Armstrong transfers in from Camp Fremont in California. Okay, you didn't hop on a jet airplane to get from California to Augusta, Georgia in those days. You took a lot of train rides to get across the country. So they have moved Armstrong from California to Augusta, Georgia. And then you look down to June 6th, and by golly, Private Armstrong has transferred out to Camp Merritt, Pennsylvania, another train ride of a day or two. So he's spending his entire week there on the trains, and probably longer. Then one of the really interesting, you'll see that the handwriting changes when you get to look at these documents, but you can see just looking down the dates, look at June 1, 2, 4, 4, 5, 3, and the date is written one way, and from June 6th on, it's written a different way. And if you start comparing some of the capital letters and some of the writing on the other document, you'll see that there are some inconsistencies. But then one of the really interesting ones, and there are others that I won't go into today, but one of the really interesting ones, June 5th, Second Lieutenant Matheson transfers to the hospital, Private Chance transfers to the hospital, and Private Stone is quarantined. Something happened on June 5th. Something happened. Well, and then Armstrong transfers out immediately after that. And then Davy Jones is put on furlough. Well, on the 7th, Stone returns to duty. On the 8th, Chance returns to duty, but it's not till the 9th, 5 days later, that Matheson is transferred from the hospital back to duty, and Jones comes back. So Christy Mathewson spent 5 of these days in the hospital for something that happened on June 5th that affected not just him, but others. It's things like that that really got my curiosity vibrating, and that have to be accounted for in whatever happened and whatever the story is. Here's another piece of, well, it's not a piece of paper, but it comes off of one. This is from Baseball Reference, and you'll notice that on June 7, Friday, June 7, and I'll come up and circle that again. So this is one of the days when Ty Cobb is in Georgia training with the military. He is also batting second, playing first base, goes 2 for 4, hits a triple, and has an RBI in a game in Detroit hosting the Washington Senators. So Ty Cobb is violating the law of physics. And there are other things like that. I didn't go through all the records, but I'm sure that they're in there. All you need, however, is one to make the argument. So there's something going on here. And then you get to some press coverage. And here you have to read between the lines in a way. But let's do that. All of these famous baseball players are put together in a training unit in the Chemical Warfare Service, and they're brought together in one place for, and one of the other things that happened is that I passed over, but that the roster, remember, covered the period June 1 to June 20, but the last entry in the daybook is June 10. So there's 10 days unaccounted for. So all these players are in town. And if you're the Army, you're going to want to publicize it. So you have your local press officer go to the local newspaper, in this case, the Augusta Herald, and say, look, we're going to have this really special thing going on, and we think you might want to do a special issue. Now, you have to realize this camp has been open for a year, but the Augusta Herald picks the very same week, June 9, up here, June 9th, to have a special issue for Camp Hancock, all about Camp Hancock. And up at the left, there's a little headline that says, 3 crack regiments make up the ordnance camp at Hancock. Men soon ready for service over the waters. And there's 3 officers here featured in the middle, including the public affairs officer. Another thing you might do, getting ready to maximize publicity, is you might schedule a baseball game, Camp Hancock against some other unit, and they did that. So here's from the Friday paper, soldiers to meet sailors Saturday, team from Charleston Navy Yard to play Camp Hancock at Warren Park, 4:30. When you read down in, it says the Camp Hancock 9 will be made up of such players as Howard, Butler, and Dwyer, former professional stars who've already cavorted on the Augusta ball lot, with the addition of such men as Gaffney, former International League slugger, who's in the ordnance department at camp. Wait a minute, those aren't the right names. Then you get to Saturday, the day of the game, and they publish the whole lineup. And the lineup for Camp Hancock is Thomas, Larson or Culp, Howard, Putnam, Dwyer, Butler, Donahue, Gaffney, and Auer. There are certain names missing. So you've created, arguably, a special Fort Hancock issue of the paper. You've scheduled a baseball game, and yet when it comes time to play the game, the wrong names are there. Now, one more supposition. If you were the editor of the paper in this situation, and remember, this is when hot type was set with great big clunky linotype machines, there were no computers, no photo setting of these papers. It was all done as physical paper. It took a while. And if you were going to put out a special edition, you had to plan it, and you would create portions of the news hole that you would allocate to various stories. And if you had reason to believe that you were going to be writing a story, a feature story about famous baseball players visiting Augusta, which was a baseball town, well, by golly, you would save a big part of the newspaper for that story. And then all of a sudden, some Army censor or the public affairs officer, whoever it is, calls up and says, well, you know, we don't really have that story, and you can't even say that you were expecting it. As the editor, you're stuck with a great big hole in the paper, say a hole about that size. So what do you do in the special edition to fill that hole? Well, what the editor did here, for whatever reason it was, is listed by name and rank, most of them are privates, every single member of the military police at Camp Hancock, 250 names. When they ran out of military police names, they started listing the churches in town. You could argue that that is filling a gap at the last minute that you didn't expect to have. So there are papers that suggest that these players are down in Georgia. I don't suggest it, they say it. There's the indirect evidence from the Augusta Herald. I also, there's an editor friend down in Augusta who used to be with an editor with the Augusta Chronicle, which is a big paper in town today. And he went back in their private archive and found no reference at all to these players being there. So there was nothing in the press. So that gets me to say a little bit more directly about the book. You know the story now, the underlying story. Book is set in 3 time periods. First time period is World War I, when something happened and there's a cover up of some sort. There's something that has to explain these inconsistencies. 1936, the year of the first selections to the Hall of Fame, when the cover up is discovered and then it's lost to history again. And then the present day. And these three timelines interact with one another all the way through the book. The principal characters from the World War I period are real people: Christy Mathewson, Cobb, Branch Rickey, some of the other players, H.R. Barnum, who was the clerk whose name appeared on the payroll of Ordnance Company 44, and George Creel. So you have some real principal characters operating through that time period. The rest of the principal characters are fictional. 1936, the main character is a fellow named J.T. Willett, who's America's premier baseball writer, and he's kind of an amalgam of Henry Chadwick and Grantland Rice and Damon Runyon. But he is the baseball writer of the era. And the second principal character from that time is a fellow named Jocko Drum, who's a ne'er-do-well, but happens through developments in the book to suddenly become a gentleman farmer. And the characters in the present day are his grandson, Jason Drum, and Jason's good friend, Adam Wallace, who's a professional writer. So these are the character sets that play through the game. Now, since the book isn't out until next week, I'm going to take the liberty of just reading a passage or two briefly. This is J.T. Willett. The character was a young fellow who grew up in Trenton, New Jersey. His family owned a tavern and he tended bar and then played cards in the back room with all the local politicians and other local bigwigs because of the bar's location, the tavern's location. They all came in. But he set himself off on a different career. He went off to New York and ended up being a baseball writer for William Randolph Hearst and the New York Daily Journal, and then later went on to the Sporting News. But this is a passage from the point at which JT discovers that he could be a baseball writer and that he could see a way to succeed. Arts and crafts. Baseball at the professional level was a craft. Its practitioners were adept at using their hands to shape the game. And the game was played within the lines. Balls, strikes, outs, hits, runs, wins, losses, standings. Baseball was addition run wild. The numbers added up, and the team with the best numbers at the end of the game was the winner. At the end of the season, the champion. But interesting as that might be to those who closely followed the sport, and integral as it might be to reporting on it, JT came quickly to realize that this basic arithmetic would not extend to newspaper circulation. Few new readers would subscribe to the journal just to read statistics. He knew he needed more, and he found it almost without trying. The players of this game were men of interest in themselves, and some of them in quite outrageous ways that matched perfectly with the style of the paper. JT befriended them, told their stories, made them famous. The communities where they lived were the collective essence of the city itself, especially its ethnic enclaves, and they were filled with prospective subscribers. JT told their stories as well through the players who became their heroes and their symbols of acceptance and achievement. And then there was the game, not exactly cerebral to the casual observer. But as JT came to understand the basics, he came as well to understand that there were stories behind the basics. Who stories, how stories, and especially why stories. Origin stories, stories of friendships and personality conflicts, funny and sad stories based on players' experience, and above all, stories of strategy and of the mental game within the game, all of which he set out to tell, even where in the great tradition of the journal, he had to make them up. If baseball was a craft, J.T. Willett became the artist who painted its portrait. And then I'll just read a short bit of dialogue. JT doesn't know the story until he gets set off on the path to find it by Jane Matheson when he goes to interview her in preparation for a story on the first class of inductees to the Hall of Fame. JT read Cobb's letter, then he read it again. Jane, what is this about? What did that old miscreant do? You know all about Chris in the war, right? And how he got accidentally gassed over there in France. And after he recovered, he came back a hero. Well, he was a hero, but not the same way that everybody thinks. There was a lot more to it. It's all that old Mr. Ricky's fault when you get down to it. Branch Rickey? Of course, Branch Rickey. Back after the war started, and you remember how the government was putting all that pressure on baseball, calling the players unpatriotic and all that. I remember. Well, one day Chris gets this letter from Mr. Rickey. Personally, I think that hypocrite Wilson put him up to it, but that's just me talking. Anyway, Chris gets this letter and it says Branch is going to be an officer and he wants Chris to come and serve in his unit. I've got that darn letter here somewhere here. And she handed JT a second document. Now, he didn't say right away what that unit was. And you know Chris, he always wanted to do the right thing. Loved the country and he loved the game. So Chris writes back and he says, yeah, of course I'll join up. Now I'll tell you, JT, I begged that man not to do it. I pleaded with him, but I never had a chance. So then just before he's ready to leave, Mr. Rickey tells him what they'll be doing, diffusing bombs and canisters of mustard gas, teaching soldiers to use gas masks as if they were experts themselves. Can you believe it? Well, I hit the roof, but Chris, he just smiled and said, Janie, somebody's got to do that work. Guess it's me. And off he went. Well, when you put all these pieces together, as far as the official record, other than these military papers is concerned, it's as if this company of baseball players at Camp Hancock never existed. It's not in the histories of baseball. It's not in the histories of the Great War. It's not in the player biographies, and it's not in those contemporaneous news accounts. Why is that? How can it be that a unit like this, a propaganda unit put together to attract attention and to further recruiting in this vital part of the military, has remained secret all this time? Well, my book, This Never Happened, is an imagined answer to that question. It's fiction. I acknowledge it's fiction, and I may have it wrong. It's a what might have been. But if what I've written is fiction, one is still left to wonder, what is the fact? If this never happened, what did? Now, there was one man who knew the answer, and that was J.T. Willett. He knew what happened. He dug out the story. He went all over the place. He had it all. But there are two problems with that. First of all, J.T. Willett was a fictional character. And second of all, he died before he got a chance to tell the story. So that part of the story is fiction, but the underlying documents are, to all appearances, fact. And I would think that they might be of interest to contemporary baseball historians, and somebody might be able to figure this one out. So here's the book. These are places where you can click through off my website and buy it. The print version is available for advanced purchase, and until May 1, I believe, there's a reduced price for advanced purchase. And the electronic versions are in the process of being loaded up now. So the Apple link, for example, there won't work, and the other links won't get you to the e-versions for a few days yet. But by a week from today, if not sooner, all of those things should be available. And that is what I've got. So let me get us out of here. And stop sharing. And there you go. I hope that was interesting.
Questions, guys? Anyone? Raise your hand. Jerry will call on you, or do it in the chat.
Well, either way, I'm not seeing everybody, so I can't really call on people who are not on my screen. Let me change views, gallery. Okay, now I can see everybody except Tom. I see you.
While you're discussing it, I had a couple questions. One is the fellow that got transferred from Camp Fremont to Camp Hancock. Did you check the records at Camp Fremont to see when he left there, and how long it took him to get to Camp Hancock in Georgia?
I did not, but there's
a second question.
Well, can I answer that one first
Right.
before I forget it? I didn't check Camp Fremont, but there's a notation on one of those documents at Camp Hancock with the date May 30th on it. So that might be the answer.
Okay. The second question is, if Camp Hancock was this chemical warfare place, it reminded me of Spring Valley in Northwest DC, which during which is an exclusive community, and Richard Nixon lived there when he was senator, I think, before he became vice president. And over the years in the 60s and 70s in the Washington Post articles, found a lot of these people that had these nice homes. They were found that there was munitions buried there. And so homes, if not, had to be moved out while they dug up all these munitions. So anything like that happened at Camp Hancock would prove that it certainly was a gas and munitions place.
Yeah, I actually, we lived in Bethesda for 25 years within a couple miles of Spring Valley. So we know that story very well. And we knew people whose homes were affected by that. This was a case of American University was doing some cooperative research, I think, with the military, and they had a range there where they were testing things. As far as Hancock, I don't know of any similar examples, but no one seems to question that this was a big ordnance training base. They had two sets of units there. One was ordnance, the other was machine gunners. And they had tens of thousands of people training there.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
Jerry, I have a question.
Sure.
Can you hear me okay? I'm not sure.
I can. It comes and goes, but yes. I can't hear you now.
Something's going wrong on my end. Can you hear me?
I can hear
No,
you.
I'm gonna log off and log back on because my Wi-Fi is not good now.
I can hear you.
I can
Okay,
hear you, but it's
I was
breaking up.
reading that game where Creel bought all the seats for the suffragettes. Oh, okay. I'll chat.
I'm looking down the chat. I haven't had a chance to look at the chat yet. Can I identify the lone woman in the photo on the public information? I cannot. I have not tracked down who's in that photo. That's an interesting question. This new evidence would convince me this never happened, but then you try and imagine things. So we don't know, at least I do not know what happened. What I came up with in my novel, and it's told as a story, is a set of facts and events, a set of events and interactions that would account for all the known facts, including the fact that the players were in two places at once. There is an explanation for that provided through the story in the book. Now, I don't know if it's the correct explanation, but if you accept both the official box scores and the official military papers, you have to have some explanation. So maybe somebody can come up with a better one than that. Oh, okay. Couple people are.
These hair clothes can stay fresh for weeks. Now they can. Downy Unstoppables in-wash scent boosters keep your laundry smelling fresh.
Jerry, I had a question.
Stephen?
Yes, I'm sorry, I missed the last 10 minutes of your presentation, but one of the things you showed earlier was a payroll, and you were able to identify, seven of the members, which were baseball players. But the other 3 or 4 people that were on that payroll were they also baseball players, or were they not?
So far as I know, they were not. There was one other name on there, Henry Jones, where there's a bit of ambiguity. I went to the Major League database that shows everybody who's ever played the game, and there was a Henry Jones who would have been not advanced in age, but probably in his 40s by that time, who played very briefly during the late 1800s. And since age was not an issue, SABR was deliberately looking for people. If you read about that time period, they were willing to take people who were older or younger than draft age. So age wouldn't have been a factor. But I had no way of knowing whether he was, and he was a cup of coffee player in any event. So the other names, there's no indication, at least in the major leagues.
Was it possible that these are people who may have not made the major leagues but played, in the minor leagues, but just never reached the major league level?
That's entirely possible, or it's also possible that they were simply other trainees who were in the unit.
Yeah, because there was a book that I don't remember the exact title of it, but it focused on I think it's not just major league, but also minor and league league players who played in the, who were in the military, who were in the major wars. I can't remember the exact book on the top of my head, and I don't know if that's a book that was in your that you use as part of your research, just to verify that these people did serve in the military, that they served during those the periods where you're researching. So, or I could be speaking out of my rear end or whatever.
Was it this book by any chance?
No, it was a much larger book. The title of my head, Jerry, is escaping me, but I know it was a book that identified players who, at all levels, who were in, everything from like the Civil War to the Vietnam War.
Yeah, no, I'm not familiar with that. But let me also say, just to be real clear, I didn't set out to write a nonfiction book here, to write an actual history. I stumbled across these documents, and I had always wanted to write a novel and never figured out a story. And all of a sudden, this one came up and kicked me in the butt from these two pieces of paper. And I just started spinning out explanations. Now, my background is in strategic communication and propaganda, political scientist, retired. And so I have that angle on it. And my head started spinning with all the things that might explain this. And that's how this story came about. So I did not set out to find all of these people and track everything. I started from the obvious set of facts and tried to explain a very apparent inconsistency.
No, I wasn't trying to get you to go on that part.
No, I understand.
I was just trying to see if, these other names that were on there, that if they had any baseball ties, because I said, 6 or 7 guys on there, and all but Davy Jones in the Hall of Fame. That's quite a group.
Well, I understand. And let me also say that one of the places that we made a few little changes in the document, particularly the roster, was in parts of those people's names, because I didn't know who they were. And even though it's 100 years, I didn't want to invade anyone's privacy or anything. So we made little tweaks to names on that list. And there, you can go see the originals on the roadshow, and there is a link to that. And you'll have to go through pretty much the machinations I did to extract it and make it legible. But the names are there, and certainly I think that's a perfectly good, valid direction to take this and find out who those people were. It's one I didn't take.
Okay, thank you for answering my question. I appreciate that, Jim.
Sure. Perry, I see you. Did you?
Okay. Yeah. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, I'm very curious about that game you alluded to earlier where Creel bought the box seats for the suffragettes. Do you have an exact date for that? Because if nobody's written a SABR Games project story about that game, I would love to.
I don't know, and I can check. I might. I'll have to find out where I found that, and also I just recently, within the last week or so, came across a reference to a game in Boston that the suffrage movement had also done that too.
Well, I immediately thought back to the game in the 1912 World Series where the Royal Rooters took over the game that stormed the field and disrupted the activities, which I thought may have been, the impetus for Creel having come up with the idea to do that with the suffragettes a few years later.
That's possible. Perry, my email's in the chat. If you'll send me your email, I'll see if I can find, I know I read that. I can't tell you offhand where I got the information. It might have been Creel's biography or somewhere else. Not his biography, but he has a story of all the things they did.
Great.
Or it might have been, since it's before the war, it might have been something else, but I'll see if I can dig out the reference for you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Also, there was one woman in the photograph with him on the board of directors of the Public Information Service. I was wondering if you knew anything about her or who she is, or
I didn't try to identify everyone in that photo, so I don't offhand. But Creel, if you let me get up for a second, Creel did a book which has been reissued, called How We Advertised America.
Okay.
And I don't know if you can see that.
Yeah, thank you.
And this is all about what they did during that period. And that might, he had a bit of an ego, but he might talk about the other people who were involved in this. One of the people who was not on the board, but a staffer, was a fellow named Edward Bernays, who after this time period went on to be the father of modern public relations. So they had a staff of interesting people on there, but I don't know who that was.
Thank you. I love this. Anything about Christy Mathewson, and there's so many mysterious things about his life and career, and I just love that you have tackled this and come up with your own solution to the mystery.
You read it and then come up with the truth.
All right. Looking forward to it.
Anyone else?
Jerry, did you talk to any doctors or medical specialists about if there was any connection between tuberculosis and being poisoned by poison gas during that era?
No, I think the consensus was that it wasn't a direct link, but his lungs were weakened, and that the traditional story has been that because his lungs were weakened, he was more susceptible to tuberculosis. The newer argument seems to be that even before any of this happened, his brother had the disease for 4 years and died of it the year before these events occurred, and there's at least an argument that he developed it that way. But no, I don't know any more than that.
I mean, tuberculosis was such a common occurrence at that time, though, especially in urban areas. So that's a very convenient cover-up story, though, of course.
Yep. Although he did have tuberculosis, and he spent his last years up at Saranac Lake, New York, in a spa. But it could be that he had the TB starting, and that made him more susceptible to the gas than Cobb. If the Cobb account is correct, any number of possibilities are there. He did die of TB. That's pretty clear.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
Anybody else? Good job, Jerry.
Thank you. And if you want to find out a little bit more about the papers and the news coverage and the like, you can go to jbmanheimbooks.com and click around a bit and see what's there. Thank you very much. I appreciate everyone paying attention and being here to listen.
We like folks from our home chapter doing their thing. So
Thanks.
For those of you guys who are not SABR members, and I think everybody here is, they're doing, because it is the 50th anniversary and it's 2021, if you sign up before April 30th, if you know anybody who's considered, they get 21% off, or anybody who's lapsed and wants to come back. I know it applies to general membership and seniors. I'm not sure about students and some of the other ones. Our newsletter should be out around May 1st. I have to finish my article. I don't know if anybody else is contributing, but hopefully we'll have that out around the first of the month. And if the Orioles, if I have my ear to the ground, we should open up between 50 and 75% capacity on June 1st. So depending on what Baltimore's mayor has to say right before that. So we are still looking to maybe do a group outing, but it wouldn't be until August or September. And if we do a minor league game this year, I don't know, all you guys are local with the exception of Perry and Ryan. We might do a AAA game since we haven't yet as the Baltimore chapter. Norfolk's a little too far, so we might do Allentown or Scranton, because that's within a decent drive, 3 hours or so. And because the minor league season is going past Labor Day this year, we might wait until August or September. So.
Yeah, I wanted to insert something about AAA. The Buffalo Bison are playing at where the Trenton Thunder are playing for this just for this season because of all the since Toronto is can't play in Canada this year. They were able to make arrangements with the Trenton Thunder to play their home games at in Trenton, New Jersey, and just for the 2021 season, and Toronto will at some point be playing in in Buffalo, New York, just like they were last year. Sorry to interrupt there. Sorry to interrupt.
That's okay. Thanks, Steve. Good for the info. There's a couple day games today for you guys that don't. I think the Phillies are on around now, and the Orioles and Miami should be coming on soon too. So other than that, hopefully we'll see a couple of you guys Sunday evening at 7 o'clock. Talk some baseball. I'll be at the game Sunday, so I should definitely be home by 7. And you guys have my email if you need anything. We're still looking good for the convention for next year. As of this time, Phoenix seems to be pretty pleased with the way everything's opening up. And I think the Hyatt definitely wants us there since we postponed so many times. So if there's no other questions, I'm going to get back to work. And hopefully we'll see you guys soon. Jerry, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And we'll see you guys relatively soon. And this will be up on SABR's site probably. Jacob will put it up there in the next 3 or 4 days. So.
Okay.
All right, guys. Have a good day. And
Thank you.
Bye.
Everybody stay safe.
Have a great day.
Thank you.